Today's reading, first reading, 2 Kings 4, 23 through 25. Another time, Elijah was on his way to Bethel, and some little kids came out from the town and taunted him. "What's up, old bald head? Out of our way, skinhead." Elijah turned, took one look at them, and cursed them in the name of God. 2 bears charged out of the underbrush and knocked them about, ripping them limb from limb, 42 children in all. Elijah went on to Mount Carmel, then returned to Samaria. May God bless our understanding of the scripture.
Yeah.
It's a tough one.
Yeah. It is a tough one. So every week we the gospel reading for today is from the Gospel according to John, chapter 14, verses 8 through 12. May God bless us in our hearing. Philip said, "Master, show us the Father, then we'll be content." You've been with me all this time, Philip, and you still don't understand? To see me is to see the Father. So how can you ask, where is God? Don't you believe that I am in God and God is in me? The words that I speak to you aren't mere words. I don't just make them up on my own. The Father who resides in me crafts each word into a divine act. Believe me, I am in my Father and my Father is in me. If you can't believe that, believe what you see, these works. The person who trusts me will not only do what I'm doing, but even greater things. Thus ends the reading. So, Todd, you're right, that's a tough reading. You didn't see that coming, did you? Yeah, that's a tough one. There's a lot of tough ones. And most of the time, we tap dance around the tough readings, or we pretend they're not there, and we don't look at them. But this stuff shapes how we think about God. And as important as it is to grasp the stuff that Jesus is, the words that are given to Jesus in the Bible, and to understand that, sometimes it's important to think about the things he doesn't say and ask ourselves why he doesn't say certain things or he doesn't characterize God in certain ways. There's a book called Your God is Too Small. It was written like 70 years ago, and I think I want to update this myself. But there's another book called Taking on the Gods by Merle Jordan, but I've always liked Your God is Too Small by J.B. Phillips, and he kind of goes through and breaks down a lot of our conceptions of God that have kind of been handed down to us over the years. And it's our conception of God is so important to us. As I've probably mentioned a number of times before, we become like the God that we worship. If we worship, a God, a warlike God, we become warlike. If we worship a God that is another way, we become that way. And Jesus is constantly trying to demonstrate the God of his understanding, the God that lives inside of him and lives inside of us. So in Your God is Too Small, J.B. Phillips lists some of these conceptions. And I'll explain them a little bit. But I looked online during the week for the craziest, most awful things God did in the Old Testament. And the worst thing I found was where he sent, this is, I don't believe this, but where the story is that God sent bears to maul children because they were making fun of Elisha, the prophet. So here's 7 characterizations of God that I think Jesus would define as idolatrous. But God as deadly lawgiver. You know, if you break a law, death. You break a law, death. God as instant executioner. You make a mistake, you write the wrong kind of fire for a sacrifice, you get the axe. God as mass murderer, flood story, and many others. Cana. God as genocidal general. All those conquest narratives. God as dangerous abuser. God as a divine deceiver. It's okay for God to lie or deceive, and that's not the God that Jesus talks about or shares with us. So from J.B. Phillips, your God is too small. You've got one of my favorites, the resident policeman. There's a lot of little rules you got to follow, and you got to behave yourself, and you got to do this and do that. The grand old man. I think this one has been torturing us for centuries, with this idea of this old guy with a long white beard on a throne. Now, I don't know if you might know this, you might not know this, but the word that we use for God actually comes from Zeus, Deus. It's from Zeus. So you might have noticed on the sign, Abba or Zeus. And I think a lot of us intellectually think we accept Abba, we accept the God Jesus talks about, but really, God's up there with lightning bolts. There's a huge gap between what I think I believe and what I tell people I believe and what I actually, in my heart of hearts, believe to be true about God. There's a huge, huge gap between those two realities. And it's real important for me to become aware of this, because if I'm not aware of it, I just kind of go on with that veneer of sort of fake Christianity. God's good, but occasionally sends a bear to maul children. Those two things, they don't mesh. They don't work together. God in a box. I've got it. We've got it. Those people over there, they don't get it. They don't get it. We're okay. We're in. They're out. Jesus goes out of his way to pick the least likely hero in pretty much every story to shatter that image, that idea of I'm in, you're out. He's always taking whoever's out and making them the star of the story. The managing director. God's up there pulling this and pulling this and arranging every little thing, and I just don't I don't believe that's God's will. I had a very narrow idea of, well, if I'm in God's will, boom, bop, bop. If I'm out, bing, bap, boof. And I think I shared this with you before. I don't think I really have time to tell the story, but I had an experience of, where I had a vision, and what came out of that vision, to give you the Reader's Digest story, is that if I'm in God's will, meaning I'm just inviting God in to be with me and to guide me through everything. I don't think God really cares if I take a left or if I take a right on the street, as long as God's with me, either way I go. Whereas we discern as a church, as a congregation, God's will is not that we pick the exact right thing that God wants us to do. And it's going to be, boof, we're going to do homeless on Wednesday. We're going to do, this on Friday. That's not it. It's just being open to that flow, open to being guided by God, open to being wrong, open to being sent in a direction that we don't see coming. And if it's God's will, we're probably not going to see it coming. It's going to be something surprise, something outside of what we imagine. Because if I can imagine it, it's probably my will. It's probably something I'm coming up with. But God's will is exciting. It's dynamic. That one I shared with the kids, the pale Galilean, one of the lamest conceptions of God. God, it's no fun. If you're doing God's will, it can't possibly be enjoyable. Can't be enjoyable. It's got to be, full of prohibitions. I can't do this. I've got to do that. And Jesus starts out by doing everything he's not supposed to do most of the time. Healing on the Sabbath. Hanging out with tax collectors and prostitutes. Doing everything, Gentiles, doing everything he possibly can. Actually, not Gentiles. They weren't around at the time. But, doing everything he can. Hanging out with Samaritans, healing them. Forgiving, doing everything against the book. But then we recast it as this boring kind of, I got to kind of go along. It's not, If your spirit is moved by disco music, God help you, but there's something in there. If that inside thing comes alive and you feel joy, God might be speaking to you in ways that you don't see. Some of my own, and these are all idolatrous. And I don't mean like idolatrous, like you're going. They're idolatrous because they're not accurate. They're not real. And part of the problem is we get real comfortable with these false or fake or wrong images of God. And we get so comfortable with them. I read one quote, it's easier to ride a camel in the direction it's going than to realize you're going in the wrong direction. And to change things, it's hard. Apparently camels are stubborn. I don't really get the reference, but it sounded like it made sense. So we need to identify what it is I really believe, because I'll tell you I believe one thing, but in a reality, I believe something different. There's a conception of God as this stingy accountant. Only so many blessings per person. You can't keep asking for more. That's why I'm so grateful to my friend Luke for sharing his show off God prayer. As sometimes I'm so afraid, can I ask for more? Most people like me have been dead for 10 or 15 years. Why do I have a right to ask for more blessings? But God's limitless, limitless flow. The strict headmaster, that was one of mine, and that kind of ties in with a pale Galilean. There's a certain set of rules, and if you're outside those rules, and the flip side of that is the self-righteousness of they're having too much fun. They can't possibly be, on the right page. They can't possibly be, in tune with God. They're enjoying themselves way too much. God would never stand for that. You got to stiffen up a bit. Hang out in a cave. And again, to me, there's like this marriage between Zeus and Santa Claus. God's watching all the time. You'll get stuff if you're good, and there's a lightning bolt if you're bad. I think that's super common, although I don't know that a lot of us would admit that, but I think that's probably the prevailing American concept of God. And it's way off. My personal one, and not to get too pop psychology on you, but I think we talked about this before too. But most of us don't get our conception of God from Sunday school or even from church. Most of us get our conceptions from God between life experience and the world around us. And I shared with you my life experience when I was a 10-year-old kid, and I prayed, God, save my mother, and my mother died. Well, that's way more powerful than 30 minutes in a Sunday school class. My lived experience did not reflect the God that I was hearing about. God answers prayers. If you pray, God will answer your prayer. God will do this, God will do this. And that didn't happen for me, so it really created a huge chasm there that took decades to overcome. And it wasn't until, I was walking on a spiritual path for quite some time, and I just continued, because I'm always looking for trouble, I just continued digging and digging and digging and digging. And I was at a place where I sort of had a comfortable idolatry, sort of a comfortable, this is good enough. You know, I'm healing up. I'm not as insane as I was. I'm not contemplating stepping in front of trains anymore. Why ask for trouble and keep digging? But that's me. You know, I've always been a seeker, and sometimes you keep seeking, you get, maybe you wish you didn't seek so much. You get answers you don't love or challenges most of the time. But I kept digging and I kept digging. And I mean, I had a conception of God that was good enough. It was working. It was keeping me sober, relatively sane. You know, my life was pretty good. But it just didn't feel deep enough. There was still this veneer over the top of sort of a toxic dump site in a way. There was still toxic ideas in there. And those need to be rooted out. So I kept digging and I kept plugging away and I kept asking for trouble. And I just kept saying stuff like, God, show yourself to me. You know, God, show me the truth. Help me to dig deeper. And as you dig, you go through parts that are scary. When you do real excavation, emotional and spiritual excavation, you dig up skeletons, right? Everything's not like, a rose that's been buried for 50 years and it's fresh as a daisy. That's not usually what happens. You come up with skeletons. So I kept digging and kept digging. You know, I realized that although I told you, and I, on some level, believed that God just loved me. That I really was that prodigal that came at the bottom of the hill, and God really was the old man that ran at a breakneck pace down the hill. I wanted to believe it so bad. But in my heart of hearts, God was really more like the resentful brother. Like, oh, you show up now. You know, I always had this idea buried very deep that God was sort of more tolerating me than enjoying me. And I realized that's how I felt as a kid. I was the youngest of 8. I was tolerated a lot of the time, in the sense of the word, not the original definition of tolerance, which is neutral. People put up with me a lot. And I feel like that's kind of what God's doing. God's putting up with me. And the predominant characteristic of God, I was trying to get the kids to kind of come out with a couple of things, but the predominant characteristic of the God of my understanding was that God was perpetually disappointed in me. You know, I'd say, well, you know, it's okay, Court, but I wish you'd done a little more with what you have. You know, you've had a lot of breaks. I wish you'd done this. You grew up in a good family. You had opportunities. You didn't really come through. You haven't really done much. That's what my dad was like. That's not God, you know. But we not even knowing it, put these parental imprints on God and give those characteristics to God. I think J.B. Phillips calls it the parental hangover. You know, and I don't even know that I'm doing this. And then I finally saw it, and I was like, oh my goodness, I really do believe that. I was running around like a nut. I was speaking all over the country. If somebody asked me to go speak in front of 8 people in Vermont on a Wednesday night, and I had to work the next day, I'd do it. I'd drive 5 hours round trip. I'd be like, I can't say no. I got to do everything I possibly can. If I say no, I'm not grateful. You know, and I'm very grateful for my wife, who said maybe you should go to bed. Maybe that would make you more useful to God if you actually slept 6 or 7 hours in a night. How about that? I was like, no, I gotta be grateful. I gotta go. He says, why don't you just rest and like pray a little bit, read something, just stop, settle down. But when you stop and you settle down, gosh, that head starts going. I gotta earn it. I gotta get out there. God is that perpetually disappointed parent. And that's going to be a life's work for me to expel that myth. And some of my best moments of when I say, no, I can't do that. I have other arrangements or other plans. I can't do it. That's so hard for me to say, no, I can't do it. Because inwardly, some part of me still believes that God's like, oh, I could have given that sobriety to somebody else, and then they probably would have done something with it. Oh, I could have given that spiritual awakening to somebody who would have done a little better, would have done a little more. And in reality, it is some group of people is going to ordain me today for the love of Pete. That's crazy. That of all the things I could be doing, my wife laughed at this yesterday, because sometimes I lament that I gave up professional poker. I think like, oh, I was really good at it. And all of these things kind of came together to derail me from that path, to put me here. I would have liked to have been on the Letterman show doing stand-up comedy, but things derailed me. And I wound up here in Holden. What the shit, And when I think about all the things I could have done that I was pretty good at, instead I wound up here where I'm completely like a fish out of water. I didn't go to church for 28 years. Out of high school, before I went back to church like 8 years ago. Didn't feel anything happening for me in a transformational way. But this is exactly where I wound up. Only God would pull a stunt like that. Only God, only makes sense to God. So as I'm like kind of kicking myself around, I completely forget all the stuff Jesus tried to teach us about who God is and how God feels about us. I wrestle with these painful readings from the Old and New Testament. There's tough stuff that somehow found its way into the New Testament, all over the place. And I wrestle with these scripture readings that are sometimes difficult. I wrestle with these ideas of God that are, just so far from what Jesus was trying to pass on. Bless you. And he says to Philip today, what are you talking about? What do you mean, show you God? This is what do you think I came here for? This is what we're doing. Wake up. Pay attention. Can't you see the healing? Can't you see the transformation in the people around you and what's going on? That's the flow of God, Philip. It's so hard for us to see this stuff because we often get tied into these old ideas, and some of those old ideas are so scary we can't even acknowledge that they're inside of us. And the first step to expunging those is going in, excavating, digging down, and exposing them to the light. And once they're exposed to the light, they can't survive in the light. The true nature of God shines through always. So I'm very grateful for Jesus. I don't know if I would have got it another way. I had a lot of spiritual experiences prior to really opening my heart specifically to Jesus, but Jesus just showed me in a new way and on a new level how God really feels about me. And it's something I just wish for everyone to really realize they're not tolerated, they're not put up with, but they are the absolute delight of God. God, I thank you for the message that you send us in so many different ways, and in today particularly through Jesus. I appreciate all the ways that you tell us you love us, but today especially I'm thankful for Jesus and the message he carried and the example he set and what he tried to show us. I ask that you bless everyone here with an open heart and an openness to let go of old ideas that hold us back from really experiencing and feeling your love. We do this in In Jesus' name, amen.